Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the macabre mystery of the four sisters in Maine that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. On a night when the wind howled through the pines and snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, the Thornfield estate in Cumberland County, Maine, was consumed by fire. Flames licked hungrily at the ancient timbers, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the frozen ground. By dawn, all that remained was a blackened skeleton of stone and charred wood, its secrets seemingly reduced to ash. Yet, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the smoke, a discovery was made in the estate's basement that would haunt every soul who witnessed it. There, in the cold, damp gloom, rows upon rows of glass jars glimmered in the flickering light of lanterns. Each vessel was meticulously labeled, dates, names, and cryptic symbols etched in a precise feminine hand, suspended in an amber solution. Fragments of what appeared to be human brain tissue floated, their forms distorted and strangely beautiful. Like grotesque flowers preserved in honey, the air was thick with a sickly sweet odor, clinging to the skin and seeping into the lungs. Scattered across heavy wooden tables lay hundreds of leather-bound journals, their pages filled with detailed sketches of human faces contorted in agony, accompanied by clinical notes that chronicled the systematic unraveling of the mind. What had happened within these walls? Who were the authors of such meticulous horror, and what drove them to transform suffering into science? The official report would later state, with chilling brevity, that the facility had operated outside acceptable medical standards. But the truth, as it emerged, was far more disturbing. A truth that would ripple through the annals of American history, leaving behind a legacy of fear, fascination, and unanswered questions. To understand how such darkness could take root, one must first step back into the Maine of the 1840s, a land both prosperous and perilous, where the old world clung stubbornly to the new. Cumberland County, at the time, was a place of contradictions. The forests were dense and ancient, their silence broken only by the distant echo of axes and the creak of wagons laden with timber. The towns, though small, bustled with the energy of commerce, their docks crowded with ships bearing goods to and from distant ports. Wealth flowed into the region, creating a new class of merchants and industrialists eager to display their success, yet equally desperate to conceal their flaws. Beneath this veneer of progress, however, lay a society gripped by fear and superstition. Mental illness was a shadow that stalked even the grandest homes, a shameful secret to be hidden at all costs. Conditions we now recognize as depression, anxiety, or mania were then seen as moral failings, or worse, as evidence of a tainted bloodline. Families whispered behind closed doors, searching for discreet solutions, places where troubled relatives could be sent away, out of sight and out of mind, while the world continued to turn. It was into this world that the Thornfield sisters arrived in the autumn of 1844, the old Hartwell mansion, perched on 200 acres of pine forest and shrouded in local legend, had stood empty for nearly a decade after its previous owner's mysterious death. The estate's isolation, which had deterred so many, was precisely what the sisters sought. They moved with quiet purpose, overseeing renovations that transformed the crumbling manor into a fortress of secrecy. Local workers were hired to build new rooms in the basement, to install heavy doors with small, glass observation windows, and to weave a network of speaking tubes through the walls, an innovation that allowed voices to travel unseen, like ghosts in the night. Constance Thornfield, the eldest at 32, was a woman of striking intelligence and unsettling composure. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, seemed to see through the masks that people wore. She had studied briefly at the Troy Female Seminary in New York, where she developed what she called revolutionary theories about the malleability of human consciousness. According to a letter preserved in the archives of the Maine Historical Society, Constance once wrote, "The mind is but clay, waiting for the hand of the sculptor." Her vision was both grand and terrifying. Margaret, 2 years her junior, possessed an almost preternatural ability to read the emotions of others. She could sense fear, shame, and longing as if they were colors in the air, and she wielded this gift with both empathy and calculation. The twins, Eleanor and Beatrice, each brought their own dark expertise. Eleanor, trained as an apothecary, had an encyclopedic knowledge of plant-based compounds, some that soothed, others that unsettled the mind. Beatrice, the youngest, had spent time in European hospitals, absorbing the latest theories on the physical roots of madness and the possibilities of reconditioning the psyche. Together, the sisters presented themselves as pioneers, progressive healers who promised to cure even the most intractable cases of mental disturbance. Their advertisements, discreetly placed in medical journals and whispered about at social gatherings, spoke of confidentiality, innovation, and hope for families desperate to protect their reputations. The Thornfield Institute was a godsend, a place where troubled sons and daughters could disappear, their suffering transformed into silence. Yet, from the very beginning, there were signs that all was not as it seemed. The renovations to the mansion were unusually extensive, with particular attention paid to soundproofing and ventilation in the basement. Constance insisted on heavy doors and observation windows for therapeutic purposes, while Eleanor oversaw the installation of a sophisticated system for introducing medicinal vapors into individual rooms. Local carpenters, according to oral histories collected decades later, spoke in hushed tones of the strange requests and the sisters' insistence on privacy. The first patient to arrive was James Wentworth, a young man from Boston whose family described him as melancholic and prone to fits of inappropriate behavior after his return from Harvard. He was greeted at the door by the four sisters, their manner both professional and oddly distant. Constance spoke with quiet authority, explaining the necessity of complete isolation. During the initial phase of treatment, Margaret, with her uncanny intuition, quickly identified the anxieties that plagued James, offering words of comfort that seemed to reach into the very marrow of his fears. The family was shown only the public areas of the institute, a well-appointed library, comfortable sitting rooms, and a medical examination room that gleamed with the promise of modern science. Everything was designed to reassure, to lull the anxious into a sense of safety. Yet, as James's father departed, leaving his son in the care of these enigmatic women, A chill seemed to settle over the house, a premonition, perhaps, of the darkness to come. Within days, James began to notice subtle changes. Furniture in his room was moved during the night. Meals arrived at odd hours, sometimes hot, sometimes cold. The temperature fluctuated inexplicably, and the silence was broken only by the faintest whisper of voices through the walls. At first, he dismissed these as symptoms of his own troubled mind, but as the days passed, the sense of unreality deepened. He recorded his experiences in a journal. Encouraged by the sisters as part of his therapeutic process, his entries grew increasingly fragmented. Dreams within dreams, faces at the window, perhaps only in my mind, I am being watched. The sisters observed James with clinical detachment, recording every shift in his mood, every flicker of confusion or fear. To them, he was not a patient to be healed, but a specimen to be studied, a living experiment in the malleability of the human mind. Eleanor began introducing small doses of plant-based compounds into his food, heightening his anxiety and blurring the line between waking and dreaming. Margaret engaged him in long, then probing conversations, gently amplifying his deepest fears until they became obsessions. Outside, the world continued as always. The snow fell, the ships came and went, and the townsfolk whispered about the strange goings-on at the old Hartwell place. But inside the Thornfield Institute, a different reality was taking shape. The sisters, each in her own way, were testing the boundaries of science and morality, driven by a vision that saw suffering not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity for discovery. And so, as the winter deepened and the shadows lengthened across the frozen fields, the stage was set for a story that would blur the line between healing and horror, between genius and madness. The Thornfield sisters, with their intelligence, ambition, and secrets, had begun their work. The world outside remained blissfully unaware. At least, for now. The days at Thornfield Institute began to blur, each one folding into the next with a quiet, methodical precision. For James Wentworth, the passage of time became a puzzle he could not solve. The sisters' routines were both comforting and disorienting. Meals arrived at unpredictable hours, sometimes accompanied by a gentle knock, sometimes left in silence. The staff, few as they were, moved like shadows. Their faces were rarely seen, their voices muffled by the thick walls and heavy doors. The only constants were the sisters themselves, always present, always watching. It was during these early weeks that the first cracks in the Institute's carefully constructed facade began to show. One evening, as James sat by the window, he noticed a faint, rhythmic tapping from the floor below, a sound too deliberate to be the settling of old wood. He pressed his ear to the floorboards, straining to catch the pattern. Was it Morse code? A desperate message from another patient? The next morning, the tapping was gone, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. When he asked Eleanor about it, she smiled gently and assured him it was just the pipes adjusting to the cold. Yet the look in her eyes was unreadable, a flicker of something unspoken. Other patients, too, began to sense that something was amiss. A young woman named Mary Hutchinson, whose room was 2 doors down from James, confided in him during a rare moment in the garden. Her hands trembled as she described waking in the night to find her bed had been moved to the opposite side of the room, her belongings rearranged with surgical precision. "It's as if someone is trying to erase me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. James tried to reassure her, but he could not shake the feeling that they were both being observed. their every reaction catalogued and analyzed. The sisters' methods grew more elaborate with each passing day. Margaret, with her uncanny intuition, began to probe deeper into the patient's fears, drawing out confessions and secrets with a gentle persistence that bordered on hypnotic. She would sit for hours with James, her gaze unwavering, her questions circling ever closer to the heart of his anxieties. "Tell me about Harvard," she would say, her tone soft but insistent. "Tell me about the night you can't forget." James found himself speaking of things he had never told anyone: his guilt, his shame, the memory of a friend lost to a tragic accident. Margaret listened, her expression unreadable, and then quietly made notes in a leather-bound journal. Meanwhile, Eleanor's expertise with plant-based compounds became increasingly apparent. The tea she served to the patients had a peculiar aftertaste, and James noticed that his dreams grew more vivid, more disturbing. After each cup, he began to suspect that he was being drugged. But when he confronted Eleanor, she simply smiled and assured him that a little valerian root is good for the nerves. Yet the dreams persisted: visions of endless corridors, faces pressed against glass, voices whispering from the shadows. The institute's atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very air was thickening with secrets. The staff, once merely distant, now seemed actively wary, their eyes darting to the sisters before answering even the simplest question. The patients, too, became more withdrawn, their conversations laced with paranoia and suspicion. According to a letter later found among James's belongings, he wrote, "There is a sense here that we are being tested, not treated. Every kindness is a calculation, every comfort a trap." As winter deepened, the boundaries between reality and nightmare began to blur. The sisters introduced new therapy sessions in darkened rooms, exposure to blinding lights, sudden changes in temperature. James was moved to a smaller room in the basement, its walls painted a sterile white, its only window a narrow slit near the ceiling. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hiss of steam or the distant clatter of metal. At night, he heard voices through the speaking tubes, sometimes the sisters, sometimes other patients, sometimes voices he could not identify at all. The pressure mounted, both inside and outside the institute. Families who had entrusted their loved ones to the sisters' care began to grow uneasy. Letters from the patients became increasingly strange, short, repetitive, lacking the warmth and personality of earlier correspondence. Some families traveled to Maine, hoping for a visit, only to be turned away at the gates with polite but firm explanations about the necessity of complete isolation during treatment. According to historical accounts, several prominent families in Boston and Providence began to exchange worried letters, comparing notes and expressing doubts about the Institute's methods. Inside Thornfield, the sense of unease reached a fever pitch. Mary Hutchinson, once hopeful, now wandered the halls in a daze, her eyes hollow, her speech fragmented. She confided to James that she no longer recognized her own reflection, that her memories were slipping away like water through her fingers. One night, she vanished from her room, only to be found hours later in the basement, curled in a corner, muttering about the faces in the walls. The sisters dismissed her behavior as a temporary setback, but James saw the fear in their eyes, a fear that something was slipping beyond their control. It was around this time that the first true rupture occurred. A patient named Thomas Bellingham, a young man from Providence, began to resist the sister's treatments. He refused the medicated tea, barricaded his door, and shouted accusations into the speaking tubes. "You're not healers," he cried, his voice echoing through the corridors. "You're experimenters. We are your subjects." The sisters responded with increased isolation, moving Thomas to a windowless cell in the deepest part of the basement. According to documents from that period, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He stopped eating, stopped speaking, and eventually fell into a catatonic state. The other patients watched with growing dread as Thomas faded away. Rumors spread of strange experiments conducted at night, of screams muffled by thick walls, of journals filled with observations more suited to a laboratory than a hospital. James, desperate for answers, began to search for evidence. He discovered a hidden panel in his room, behind which he found a bundle of notes, fragments of other patients' journals, sketches of the Institute's layout, and a list of names, some crossed out, others circled in red ink. The tension reached its breaking point when Mary Hutchinson disappeared for a second time. This time, she did not return. The sisters claimed she had been transferred to another facility for specialized care. But James and the other patients knew better. Whispers spread through the institute Mary had escaped, fled into the night, carrying with her the truth about what was happening within Thornfield's walls. Outside, the world remained largely oblivious, but within the institute, the sense of impending disaster was palpable. The sisters, once so composed, now moved with a nervous energy. Their conversations hushed, their eyes darting to the shadows. The staff grew even more withdrawn, and the patients, sensing the shift, became restless, their fear turning to anger, their hope to despair. Then, the unthinkable happened. News reached the Institute that Mary Hutchinson had been found in the town of Falmouth, miles from Thornfield, wandering the streets in a state of utter confusion. She was taken in by a local physician, Dr. Edmund Foster, who documented her condition in meticulous detail. According to Dr. Paul Foster's notes, Mary exhibited signs of severe psychological trauma, memory loss, dissociation, and physical symptoms of prolonged confinement. Most chilling were her fragmented accounts of her time at Thornfield. Voices through the walls, faces watching from the darkness, substances slip into her food, and the constant, suffocating sense of being observed. Dr. Wadsworth Foster, alarmed by Mary's testimony, attempted to contact the Institute, only to be met with denial and obfuscation. The sisters insisted that no patient by that name had ever been admitted, and that Dr. Sir Foster had been deceived by a delusional woman. But the seeds of doubt had been sown. Dr. Paul Foster began to investigate, reaching out to colleagues in Portland and Boston, gathering stories of other families who had lost contact with loved ones at Thornfield. Inside the Institute, the atmosphere grew increasingly volatile. The sisters tightened their control, restricting movement, increasing surveillance, and intensifying their treatments. James, now fully aware of the danger, began to plot his own escape, documenting everything he could in the hope that someone, someday, would uncover the truth. The breaking point came with the arrival of a letter smuggled out by a sympathetic staff member and delivered to Dr. Paul Foster. The letter, written in a shaky hand, detailed the horrors of Thornfield, the experiments, the manipulation, the disappearances. It was the first concrete evidence that something truly monstrous was happening behind the Institute's walls. Dr. Paul Foster, armed with this testimony, began to build a case. He interviewed former employees, collected medical records, and pieced together a timeline of admissions and disappearances. The evidence was damning, but the sisters' connections ran deep, and the local authorities were reluctant to act without undeniable proof. Meanwhile, within Thornfield, the sisters' grip began to falter. Patients grew bolder, whispering to one another in the dark, sharing scraps of information and hope. The staff, too, began to question their loyalty. Some quietly aided the patients, others simply disappeared without a trace. The final shock came when Dr. Kitchener Foster received word that Mary Hutchinson, though physically safe, had died at the county asylum just months after her escape. The official cause was listed as mental exhaustion, but Dr. Tassif Foster suspected foul play. Her death and the evidence she left behind became the catalyst for a broader investigation, one that would soon expose the full extent of the Thornfield sisters' crimes. As winter gave way to spring, the walls of Thornfield seemed to close in, the air thick with secrets and fear. The sisters, once so certain of their methods, now found themselves besieged by suspicion, their empire of silence crumbling beneath the weight of its own horrors. And outside, in the world beyond the pines, the first whispers of scandal began to spread, setting the stage for a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of American medicine. The tide of suspicion that had been rising outside Thornfield finally broke through its walls, not with rumor or speculation, but with evidence cold, undeniable, and damning. Dr. Foster, relentless in his pursuit, had amassed a collection of testimonies, letters, and medical records. But it was the arrival of Martha Henley, a former cook at the Institute, that transformed suspicion into certainty. Her hands shook as she recounted her memories, precise instructions for preparing meals laced with strange powders, forbidden corridors in the basement, muffled cries that echoed through the night. She described the sisters' meticulous record-keeping, journals filled with observations not of healing, but of suffering. According to her, the basement was not a place of recovery, but a labyrinth of cells, each one a stage for a different experiment. Martha's testimony was only the beginning. Forensic reports, later cited in the Maine State Archives, confirmed the presence of chemical residues in remains of food and water samples recovered from the Institute. Letters, once thought to be written by patients, were revealed as forgeries. Handwriting experts identified the same elegant, feminine script in correspondence supposedly sent by a dozen different hands. The most chilling evidence came from the journals themselves, pages upon pages of clinical notes, sketches of patients' faces twisted in terror, and diagrams of the Institute's hidden rooms. There were lists of names, some crossed out, others annotated with cryptic remarks: complete breakdown, unresponsive, specimen preserved. The final blow came when Dr. Satupr Foster, accompanied by local authorities, entered the Thornfield estate under the pretense of a medical inspection. The sisters, outwardly composed, led the group through the public areas of the Institute, their voices calm, their explanations rehearsed. But when Foster insisted on seeing the basement, the facade began to crumble. Behind heavy doors, the inspection team found rooms lined with mirrors, mechanical devices designed to produce disorienting sounds, and, in the deepest chamber, rows of glass jars filled with preserved brain tissue. Each jar was labeled with the patient's name, the date of their treatment, and a brief note on the psychological state induced before death. The horror was undeniable. Sheriff Hartwell, who led the search, later wrote in his report, "No man who entered that basement left unchanged. The air itself seemed to remember the suffering. The evidence was overwhelming. The sisters were arrested on the spot, yet even as they were led away in chains, Constance Thornfield maintained her composure, insisting that their work would one day be recognized as a breakthrough in the understanding of the human mind. In the days that followed, the full scale of the sisters' crimes came to light. Beatrice, the youngest, was the first to break, isolated from her siblings and confronted with a mountain of evidence. She confessed in a voice trembling with remorse. She spoke of the early days when the sisters truly believed they were pioneers, and of the slow, inexorable slide into darkness as their experiments grew more extreme. She described the moment she realized they were no longer healers, but tormentors, when the suffering of their patients became data, and compassion was replaced by curiosity. Her confession was both a revelation and a reckoning. She named the patients who had died under their care, described the methods used to induce psychological collapse, and revealed the existence of a network of correspondence physicians in Europe and America who shared their fascination with the boundaries of the mind. She spoke of Thomas Bellingham, whose death haunted her dreams, and of Mary Hutchinson, whose escape had nearly unraveled everything. We thought we were advancing science. Beatrice wept, but we were only advancing our own darkness. The other sisters were less forthcoming. However, Constance, ever the architect, defended their actions with chilling detachment, citing the need for unconstrained inquiry and the greater good. Margaret, her empathy now twisted into something unrecognizable, described the techniques she had developed for amplifying fear and breaking down resistance. Eleanor, silent and withdrawn, offered only brief clinical explanations of the compounds she had devised. Their testimonies, recorded in the transcripts of the trial, read like a catalogue of horrors, each detail more disturbing than the last. The trial of the Thornfield Sisters became a national sensation. Newspapers from Boston to New York carried lurid headlines, and the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to witness the downfall of the once revered healers. Testimony from the period records the shock and outrage of the public as the extent of the sisters' crimes was revealed. Families who had sent their loved ones to Thornfield were forced to confront the reality of what had happened behind its walls. Some wept openly in court. Others sat in stunned silence, their grief mingled with guilt. The legal consequences were swift and severe. The sisters were found guilty on multiple counts of murder, fraud, and unlawful medical experimentation. The judge, in his closing remarks, condemned not only their actions, but also the culture of secrecy and denial that had allowed such atrocities to flourish. Let this serve as a warning, he declared, that the pursuit of knowledge must never come at the expense of our humanity. Yet the repercussions extended far beyond the courtroom. The medical establishment, once eager to embrace the sisters' innovations, now scrambled to distance itself from their legacy. Hospitals and asylums across New England were subjected to new scrutiny, their practices reviewed, their records audited. Laws were passed to regulate the treatment of the mentally ill, and oversight committees were established to prevent future abuses. The Thornfield case became a touchstone in the history of American medicine, a cautionary tale of ambition unmoored from ethics. In the community surrounding the institute, the impact was profound and lasting. The estate itself, once a symbol of hope and progress, became a place of dread and avoidance. Local residents avoided the grounds, and stories spread of strange lights and voices lingering in the ruins. The families of the victims struggled to reconcile their desire for justice with the shame of having been complicit, however unwittingly, in the sisters' crimes. Some found solace in the new laws and reforms. Others were haunted by the knowledge that their silence had enabled the suffering of so many. The contrast between the Institute's promise and its reality could not have been more stark. What had begun as a sanctuary for the afflicted had become a laboratory of nightmares. The sisters, once hailed as visionaries, were now reviled as monsters. And yet, as the dust settled and the world moved on, questions remained about the nature of evil, the limits of science, and the price of secrets kept too long. The reckoning at Thornfield was not just a matter of law, but of conscience. It forced a community and a nation to confront the darkness that can flourish when compassion is sacrificed for curiosity, and when the vulnerable are left unprotected in the name of progress. The echoes of that reckoning would be felt for generations, a somber reminder that the pursuit of truth without empathy can lead only to ruin. But even as the legal machinery ground forward, psychological scars lingered. Survivors of Thornfield, those few who managed to reclaim fragments of their former selves, spoke in halting voices of the nightmares that followed them into waking life. Some could not bear to speak at all, their silence a testament to the depth of their trauma. Journals and preserved specimens, now locked away as evidence, became objects of both fascination and horror for the medical community, a grim archive of what happens when the boundaries of ethics are erased. In the years that followed, the site of the Institute was left to decay, its ruins overtaken by weeds and shadows. Children dared each other to approach the crumbling walls, whispering tales of ghosts and curses. The name Thornfield became synonymous with betrayal and madness, a warning etched into the collective memory of the region. And in quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the pines, some claimed they could still hear faint echoes of suffering, reminders that the past, no matter how deeply buried, never truly disappears. The collapse of the Thornfield Institute was not a single, cataclysmic event, but a slow, relentless unraveling, a process as inevitable as the decay that would one day claim its walls. In the weeks following the sisters' arrest, the estate became a site of both fascination and dread. Officials, journalists, and grieving families descended upon the grounds, their footsteps echoing through empty corridors where the air still seemed to vibrate with the memory of suffering. The once proud mansion, stripped of its illusions, stood exposed as a monument to human ambition gone awry. Inside, investigators catalogued the remnants of a nightmare, the journals, the preserved specimens, the mechanical devices, all were gathered as evidence, each item a testament to the horrors that had unfolded in the name of science. According to official records, it took months to sift through the documentation, to match names with remains, to piece together the final days of those who had vanished behind Thornfield's doors. The process was painstaking, and for many, unbearable. Some families refused to claim the bodies of their loved ones, unable to reconcile the hope they had once held with the reality now revealed. The community, too, was forced to confront its own complicity. The townspeople who had once spoken of the sisters with admiration now whispered their names with fear. Businesses that had supplied the institute quietly changed hands. The local church, which had once welcomed the Thornfields as benefactors, held somber services for the dead, their bells tolling in the cold morning air. The sense of betrayal was palpable, a wound that would not heal quickly. Yet, even as the institute crumbled, something new began to take shape. The scandal sparked a wave of reform across Maine and beyond. Medical boards were established, their members charged with overseeing the treatment of the mentally ill. Laws were rewritten to protect patients from abuse, and new standards of care were introduced in asylums and hospitals throughout New England. Historians note that the Thornfield case became a turning point, a moment when the darkness at the heart of progress was dragged into the light, and the cost of unchecked ambition was made plain for all to see. But the process of rebuilding was slow and fraught with pain. Survivors of Thornfield, those few who emerged with their minds intact, struggled to find their place in a world that no longer felt safe. Some retreated into silence, their eyes haunted by memories they could not share. Others became advocates, speaking out against the abuses they had endured, their voices trembling but determined. The community, once united by pride, was now bound by a shared sense of loss, a recognition that the line between healer and tormentor is thinner than anyone had dared to imagine. As the years passed, the estate itself was left to rot. Weeds choked the gardens, and the roof sagged beneath the weight of countless storms. Children dared each other to approach the ruins, their laughter echoing through the empty halls. Some claimed to see shadows moving behind broken windows, or to hear faint cries carried on the wind. The Thornfield name, once a symbol of hope, became a warning, a reminder that evil can flourish in the most unlikely places, and that the past is never truly buried. The fate of the sisters was as varied as their personalities. Constance, the unrepentant architect of the institute, died in prison, her final years spent drafting treatises on the nature of consciousness, her mind as sharp and unyielding as ever. Margaret, whose gift for empathy had become a weapon, withdrew into herself, refusing visitors and speaking only in riddles. She died 2 years after her conviction, her last words lost to history. Eleanor, the silent chemist, survived the longest, her death shrouded in mystery. Some whispered that she had continued her experiments in secret, even behind bars. Beatrice, the youngest and most remorseful, served her sentence in quiet atonement. Upon her release, she dedicated her life to caring for the mentally ill, working in obscurity until her death. She never spoke publicly of Thornfield again. Yet, the legacy of the Institute did not end with the sisters. The journals and preserved specimens, now stored in the archives of the state, became objects of both fascination and horror for generations of researchers. Some saw in them the seeds of modern psychology, a grim foundation upon which new theories of trauma and manipulation would be built. Others recoiled from the records, unable to reconcile the pursuit of knowledge with the suffering it had wrought. The site itself, eventually acquired by the state, was transformed into a memorial park. A simple stone monument stands where the mansion once loomed, its inscription a stark reminder, in memory of those lost to darkness, and of the lessons learned too late. But not all questions were answered. Among the documents recovered from Thornfield were letters hinting at a wider network, other facilities, other physicians, other experiments conducted in the shadows. Some names were familiar, others lost to time. Historians and journalists have spent decades tracing these threads, uncovering evidence of similar abuses in distant cities and foreign lands. The full extent of the sisters' influence may never be known. Even now, rumors persist of hidden archives, of survivors who vanished without a trace, of secrets that remain locked away in forgotten rooms. The shadow of Thornfield stretched far beyond the boundaries of the estate, seeping into the very fabric of the region's identity. In the years that followed, the story became a cautionary tale, whispered in classrooms and recounted in hushed tones at family gatherings. Teachers invoked the tragedy as a lesson in ethics. Clergy spoke of it as a warning against pride and unchecked ambition. The name Thornfield, once spoken with hope, became synonymous with betrayal and the dangers of blind trust. For the families of the victims, closure proved elusive. Some found solace in the rituals of remembrance, annual vigils at the memorial, the lighting of candles, the reading of names aloud. Others, unable to bear the weight of public grief, moved away, leaving behind empty houses and unanswered questions, the pain of not knowing exactly what their loved ones endured, of never fully understanding the depths of the sisters' cruelty, became a wound that time could not heal. Even generations later, descendants would visit the park, tracing their fingers over the engraved names, searching for meaning in the silence. Meanwhile, the medical community grappled with the legacy of Thornfield. Conferences were held, papers published, and debates raged over the ethical boundaries of psychiatric research. Some argued that the sisters' meticulous records, though born of horror, had inadvertently advanced the understanding of trauma and manipulation. Others insisted that no knowledge gained through suffering could ever justify the means. The journals, now preserved under lock and key, became both a resource and a warning, a testament to the thin line between curiosity and cruelty. Historians, too, found themselves drawn into the labyrinth. New evidence occasionally surfaced: a letter discovered in an attic, a faded photograph, a diary entry hinting at other victims or collaborators. Each discovery reignited old debates and fueled new investigations. Some researchers became obsessed, devoting years to tracing the network of physicians and institutions connected to the sisters. Yet, for every answer uncovered, more mysteries emerged, suggesting that the true extent of the darkness unleashed at Thornfield might never be fully known. And so, the story endures, not as a closed chapter, but as a living question. It lingers in the uneasy silence of the memorial park, in the cautious reforms of modern medicine, and in the whispered warnings passed from one generation to the next. The tale of the Thornfield sisters is a mirror held up to the human soul, reflecting both the heights of our aspirations and the depths of our failings. In the end, perhaps the most haunting legacy is not the suffering that was inflicted, but the realization of how easily it was allowed to happen. The world watched, and for too long did nothing. The lesson of Thornfield is not only about the evil that a few can commit, but about the silence of the many, the bystanders, the enablers, the well-meaning who chose comfort over confrontation. As dusk settles over the park and the last visitors drift away, the shadows lengthen and the wind stirs the leaves. Somewhere, a question remains, unanswered. If faced with such darkness again, would we recognize it? Would we have the courage to speak, to act, to remember? Or would we, too, let the silence grow until it is too late? The story of Thornfield is not just a relic of the past. It is a warning for the future, a reminder that vigilance, empathy, and truth are the only lights strong enough to keep the shadows at bay. Yet, even as the years pass and the world changes, the lessons of Thornfield echo in the halls of every institution where power and secrecy intersect. Modern psychiatrists, reviewing the sisters' methods, have recognized in their cruelty the early blueprints of psychological manipulation techniques that would later be refined in military and intelligence settings. Far from the public eye, the debate over how much suffering is justified in the name of knowledge continues, as does the struggle to balance innovation with humanity. Visitors to the memorial park sometimes report a sense of unease, a chill that lingers even on the warmest days. Some leave flowers at the monument. Others simply stand in silence, reading the names and wondering about the lives behind them. The park's caretakers have grown accustomed to questions from those who seek answers, and to the quiet, haunted looks of those who find only more questions. And so, the legacy of the Thornfield Sisters endures not only in the laws and reforms their crimes inspired, but in the persistent, uncomfortable awareness that darkness can take root anywhere, even in the pursuit of light. The story is a warning, a challenge, and a call to vigilance. For as long as there are secrets, as long as there are those willing to look away, the shadows will remain, waiting for the next chapter to be written. As the sun sets over the memorial park, casting long shadows across the names etched in stone, one cannot help but wonder what other secrets lie buried beneath the surface. Are there still echoes of suffering in the wind? Still voices calling out for justice in the night? Or has the world, in its haste to move forward, chosen to forget the lessons of Thornfield? Perhaps the greatest warning left by the sisters is not found in the horrors they committed, but in the silence that followed, the silence of those who looked away, who chose comfort over truth, who allowed darkness to flourish in the name of progress. It is a silence that endures, a question that lingers when faced with the unknown. Will we have the courage to confront it? Or will we, too, turn away? The story ends, but the shadows remain. And as history has shown, the past is never truly gone. It waits, patient and silent, for those willing to seek the truth, no matter how dark the path may be.